All right, welcome to Halitics. So glad to talk to you. I'm Hal Ginsberg on Wednesday, and you can see the slide there. This is the topic we're going to get into is the bodies there in Gaza that are just being buried unceremoniously in a ditch by a bulldozer. Is that the same as the concentration camp or death camp victims stacked like cordwood by the Nazis? And I think that's really why a lot of us get bogged down on whether this is indeed a genocide, because there aren't death camps, right? I mean, I've argued, I think it's very fair to call Gaza itself a giant concentration camp along the sea. But it's not a death camp in the sense that the people who lived in a particular region are simply put into boxcars, taken to a facility where they're dispatched. It's not quite the same. It's not like there's an abattoir, slaughterhouse. It's not quite the same, and I think that is what probably trips many of us up, including myself. Gives me sort of a queasy feeling when I say, okay, this is genocide. And then you also run into the question of whether the intent is to truly eliminate an entire ethnic group. Are the Palestinians of Gaza a distinct ethnic group as opposed to Palestinians, as opposed to Arabs, as opposed to Muslims? With the Nazi Holocaust, the Jews were clearly the target, Jewish people, and then other groups as well, other distinct ethnic groups like Gypsies were also targeted for ultimate annihilation. That seems a little more clear-cut, does it not? And there's even more distinctions you can raise. The definition of genocide doesn't specify that there has to be a organized effort by the government to round up and kill everybody who fits within a particular genetic group or religious group. That's not how genocide is defined. That's, I think, how many of us think about it. We think about the Armenian genocide. As far as I know, there weren't death camps that Turkey had set up in the first decade or so of the 20th century and into the 1910s and 20s. There weren't death camps, but there were periodic pogroms where mostly Turkish Muslims would simply slaughter Armenians living in their midst. That would seem to fit the definition. Likewise, when the Hutus, the two tribes in Rwanda, were at odds, and the Hutus were, just taking machetes and slaughtering Tutsis, that wasn't a case where you had organized transport of a particular group of people, a particular tribe, to a place where they were massacred, where they were murdered. But it's still considered a genocide because there was a concerted effort by the government with radio hosts and others, demagogues, egging on one group, one tribe, one distinct tribe to just simply murder people because they were members of another tribe. So that would seem to fit. The question then, is, do we feel comfortable using the definition as it's been applied either recently or when you look at, I think what we would generally all accept as true genocidal acts, what Nazi Germany did to Jews, but also to Gypsies most notably. Is that comparable? Do we view that as similar to what Israel's doing? And I would say it's not totally clear. It isn't totally clear. If you look at the Article 4 of the International Court of Human Rights, and this is as it was applied in Yugoslavia when the Serbians were murdering Bosnian Muslims, they concluded that there certainly were acts within Bosnia that met the definition by Serbia, acts by the Serbs that definitely met the definition of genocide. And again, you defined the group relatively narrowly, so it wasn't all Muslims. There was no either effort by or probably even an intent by Serbia to murder every Muslim. There are over 1 billion Muslims. I don't think that was really what was the understanding of the murderers and the individual people that they pushed to kill others. I don't know that they were ever saying we're going to get rid of all Muslims. We're going to wipe the world free of Muslims the way the Nazis truly hoped, to basically kill all Jews, at least all European Jews, and then perhaps beyond at some point. But the distinct group was the Bosnian Muslims, and they were targeted for extinction. So that would meet the definition. You could say that the Gazan Palestinians, I think it's fair to say that's a very large group of people, almost 2.5, somewhere around 2.5 million people. And it's not only Gazan Palestinians that Israel is killing. It's not only Gazan Palestinians that Israel is displacing. It also includes West Bank Palestinians, the two areas where there are a core, a center of Palestinians. So does Israel, what Israel has been doing lately, but looking back even to the early 21st century, first years, does this, or even before, does that constitute genocide? In your view, does that constitute genocide in terms of some understanding, objective understanding of the term? Again, this is Halitics. I'm Hal Ginsberg. Give me a call, 240-242-5646. I'd love to talk to you, 240-242-5646. There was a excellent, I believe, very informative, when I say excellent, very informative conversation on PBS where they discussed this issue. And so we'll get to that, and I'll play it. I think one of the ways that we can understand and maybe make decisions about who's right when there's a dispute, a disagreement, are those who insist Israel is being unfairly tarred with the genocidal G, with the scarlet G. Are they making good points? And if you listen to their arguments and you parse them and you compare them with those who say, no, this is correct, what Israel's doing is genocide, then I think you can come to a better understanding. We can also ask the question, does it even matter? Given the number of dead, given the amount of killing that we're seeing right now, the ongoing murders there, is that sufficient for you to say it doesn't really matter? This is what Israel is doing. And so we can ask all those questions, and we'll continue to ask them. Again, I'd love to talk to you, 240-242-5646. This is such an important topic. I don't think it's something we can just simply, sweep under the carpet or, kind of elide. It is important, and for a variety of different reasons. So let's look real quick at, I just want to get into this question of the numbers before we get to the discussion, the debate that we see on PBS. I just want to look at some of the kind of generally accepted facts. I want to thank Andy Ellis for providing this. This is from the United Nations. This is a report that came out to give you some understanding of the context, the scope of what's happening. Somewhere around 24,250, 285 reported fatalities right now of Palestinians. That's dead. About 1% of the total population. A sizable village, a small city, just simply wiped out of Palestinians. And I put below it this kind of daily cumulative chart. I think it's instructive. Because what this shows is an ongoing, consistent effort to kill Palestinians by Israel. And whether that was their actual intent, clearly the actions by Israel reflect activity that led to a very, very consistent death toll. You can see it's a relatively straight line. The slope of the number of dead rising relatively consistently since the October 7 catalyst, which was, of course, the Hamas attack. And we'll talk about that too, why that may or may not be pertinent to the question whether Israel is committing genocide. But I think it does show an ongoing pattern and practice by Israel to kill Palestinians. And that would seem to me to be consistent with the argument that, yes, Israel is committing genocide. And for what it's worth, and I don't know how relevant it is, but you see the same thing, and I think it has importance when you look at the number of wounded, of casualties. You see sort of the same thing, and maybe the chart is slightly flattening out towards the top. It does seem to me still pretty consistent number of casualties, reported injuries because of ongoing Israel military action and occupation in Gaza. It's a horrible, atrocious picture. Whether this is genocide or not, I think you have to acknowledge it's indefensible. It's not something you can look at and say there's some legitimate reason for doing this. And that it becomes especially clear when you consider what Israel went through, because one of the arguments you hear, of course, from Israel is, well, Hamas started it. And that ignores, elides the decades of Israeli occupation, the decades of Israeli pounding, bombardments, and killing in the West Bank and Gaza. But even if you want to say, and I think it's fair, or Israel's responding in part, certainly what part of their action is response, is this response in any way proportional? One of my Halitics commenters seems to think yes, and I'll show that. I think the response by those who argue this is what Israel has a right to do, it's not Israel's fault, it's on Hamas, I think those arguments actually are so transparently ridiculous that they actually make the case against Israel stronger. If that's the best you can do, well, Israel gets to kill lots and lots of civilians, of children, it gets to level an area where there are 2.5 million people living, turn it into a wasteland because a crime was committed against Israel in one day, then I think it proves your argument is fallacious. So Israel did suffer about a little over 1,000 deaths, at least reported, total, including a number of Israeli Defense Forces troops and about 5,400 injuries. So we're looking at about 1/20th of the total, less than 1/20th now of the dead Israelis compared to the number of Palestinians killed, and a much higher percentage, by the way, of civilian Palestinians killed, and then 5,400 reported in. That all occurred, or almost all of it occurred on one day. Some troops in Gaza have been killed, some Israeli troops, but it's hard to say that those dead troops in any way are relevant, because the only reason they were killed is because they were in Gaza to begin with. And there were obviously alternatives that Israel could have pursued besides just relentless, ongoing bombing and siege, basically cutting off the entire region. There were, other alternatives that they chose not to, and most particularly, again, let's get the United Nations involved. But they chose not to do that. Just a little more on the numbers. I think that these are really important, and I wanted to show this because this is really consistent. These numbers, I think, are consistent with the definition of genocide. In Palestine, this is from the United Nations. So if you want to reject their data, you can go ahead and reject it. Obviously, we've seen a lot of pictures that show just the extent of the damage. Cities just leveled, buildings just completely toppled, hospitals under attack. Those are documented. It's not as though we have to rely on witnesses who may or may not be found. Like we do have to rely, if we're going to believe Israel's claim that Hamas committed sex crimes, widespread sex crimes on October 7th, then we have to believe witnesses, many of whom cannot even be found because we don't have the forensic evidence. We don't have the video footage. We don't have the pictures. But we do have the pictures, of course, of the destruction done to Gaza by Israel. 2.2 million of the somewhere 2.5 million or so Gazans are at imminent risk of famine. And it's not just imminent risk, right? It's 378,000 now considered to be at catastrophic levels. Extreme lack of food, starvation, exhaustion of coping capacities, and almost 1 million more at phase 4. 1 out of 3 water pipelines are now operational. There's no access to clean water in much of Gaza. And if you look again, I just want to put this up again, the definition here of what consists of genocide. If you look at C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. So if you have 1 million people out of 2.5 million who are either currently starving or at risk of starvation, very serious risk, that would seem to me to meet the definition. Again, I think one of the challenges we face is, does this definition meet what we consider to be genocide? Because as I've expressed, for me, you do consider, I consider very seriously that whole idea of rounding people up and killing them. Putting them at the, digging a pit, making them dig a pit, stand on the edge of the pit, and then machine gunning them. That is genocide to me. Transporting them to a camp where they're worked to death with virtually no food, water, and then ultimately put in a chamber where they're gassed. That is genocide to me. That's not what we were seeing in Gaza. That's not the definition. That's not required for genocide, but that's something I think we all think about when we think about genocide. Let's get to and just a little bit more data, and then I do want to show the video, which is quite long, and I'll interrupt it. I don't know if I'll play all of it, but I think it's important to hear from both Kenneth Roth and the commentator, who doesn't exactly defend Israel, but does claim that they're not committing a genocide. So I think the hospital attacks are relevant. I mean, obviously hospitals are life-saving institutions. 15 are partially functional. I guess the 19 are not functional. You see all the people there who are not getting treated, critical shortages of drugs, blood drug products and supplies. No kids are going to school. 90% of the school buildings are sustaining significant damage. And again, the definition of genocide does include kind of preventing people from having kids or attacking kids or preventing any sort of it focuses, and I'm looking at it right now, I'll just put that up real quick, forcibly transferring children of a group to another group. So we're not seeing that, but we're seeing the complete cessation of education for them. So, yeah, that's consistent with the claim that this is genocide. All right, so let's go to the debate. By the way, if you want to join me, always 240-242-5646. Would love to talk to you. Haven't gotten calls lately. John has not been weighing in. He's always been my reliable caller, and I don't know whether he stopped watching or stopped following. I think I said some things he didn't agree with, and I think that's very unfortunate. I mean, I get that. We all want to watch. We all want to have our own views reinforced, and that's something I don't do. And I'm sure that kills me in terms of the numbers. I think people tune in for a while. They say, right, attaboy, Hal, to the extent they find my programming somewhat compelling. And then I say something that they're just like, I can't agree with that. That's just terrible. I'm not going to go along with that. And then they turn off. And I mean, I don't know what I can't do it. I mean, I will not conform to what I believe a certain group of people want me to say. I just cannot do that. And I think it's unfortunate because, I mean, I guess that's unfortunate for me, but I think what I was going to say is unfortunate is that we're so and I include myself in this, we seem unwilling to listen to those that don't share our views on issues that are important to us. And that's very, very unfortunate, because don't we need to? Isn't that what we should be doing? Is listening to others, debating, discussing with others what we, these critically important issues. And it seems like for whatever reason, we have trouble with that. And I wish it weren't the case. I really, really, because I think we'd get farther if we could listen to people. And I don't know that I do. I'll be honest. I try. I try to respond directly to comments like people who doubt the climate holocaust. I try to present the evidence that supports my view, but also to look at the evidence they present and to respond directly to it. I think that's what we all have to do. And that's what I'm doing here, because I know a lot of people don't agree. They don't agree that this is a genocide. They don't even think, for example, we'll see a quote from a New York Times columnist who doesn't even think Israel's doing anything wrong. And to me, that's insane. How could you not think what Israel's doing is wrong? But there are people who feel that way. And I'm trying, even with this live stream today, to, to get that. Say, okay, do you have a point? Is what you're saying fair? All right, before we got the little subscribe now button, something I've been working on, and I'm still probably needs a little more work, but we'll get there. Do click subscribe though, even if you don't think the subscribe now button is perfect. Do click subscribe, bottom right, Halitics. Here is PBS NewsHour doing, I think, a really phenomenal job. I want to, I frequently criticize media. When they get it right, I think they deserve our praise, and especially because they're so incredibly important.
So how strong is South Africa's case against Israel? And what will be Israel's defense when tomorrow it presents its case? We get two views. First to Kenneth Roth, the former executive director of Human Rights Watch and now a visiting professor at Princeton University and senior fellow at Harvard University. Ken Roth, thanks very much. Welcome back to the NewsHour. How strong a case do you believe South Africa has that Israel has demonstrated the intent to destroy all or part of a racial, religious, or ethnic group, in this case, the Palestinians?
South Africa assembled an incredibly talented legal team and put together a factually detailed, legally compelling case. I think there's not much question that the level of killing, the level of deprivation is sufficient to meet that predicate part of the crime of genocide.
All right, I'm going to stop it right there. So we already went over a lot of the numbers. 1% of the population already killed, and then you have the deprivations and the likelihood of mass starvation, mass disease deaths. So he's saying those numbers are what really do meet the predicate. And he is, I guess, defining the ethnic group as the Gazan Palestinians.
The South African case really had two elements to it in showing genocidal intent. One is they ran through a bunch of statements by senior Israeli officials. They looked at Prime Minister Netanyahu's reference to Amalek, an Israeli enemy where the biblical injunction was to kill every man, woman, child, and animal. They used Yoav Gallant, the defense minister's statement, that he's going after that they're fighting human animals. He says, oh, I just meant Hamas.
So using the terms that Israel folks have said to show the intent, defining the Palestinians as animals, as clearly indicating an intent to wipe them out, that they're not human, they're subhuman, they're not deserving of consideration, and therefore it's fine to kill them. And of course, that's what the Nazis did too, consistently dehumanizing with language, with propaganda, the people that they were killing.
But in fact, if you listen to him, he was talking about the siege, which is of everybody in Gaza. So they ran through statements like that.
Yeah, and so what he's saying there too is it's not just Hamas that the Israeli defense minister is referring to as animals. It's not just Hamas militants. It's the entire population of Gaza that is now, of course, being subject to the killing.
They had a very moving section where they had a bunch of Israeli soldiers singing and dancing and saying there are no uninvolved civilians, basically an invitation to war crimes. So this is all genocidal intent. And then they also kind of work backwards from the acts on the ground to say that because Israel is bombing so indiscriminately, because it's using these massive 2,000-pound bombs in heavily populated areas, that this also shows an indifference to Palestinian civilian life, which itself is indicative of genocidal intent.
Israel says that many of the statements that are cited by the South Africans are about Hamas, not about Gaza. The official war policy, of course, is to respond to Hamas and prevent it from launching another terrorist attack. But they also say that for every statement that the South Africans choose, there are many other statements by the same Israeli officials saying that they are trying to avoid civilian casualties. And again, the official policy is to attack Hamas, not all of Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, they say that's the official policy, but when you have the prime minister talking about Amalek, saying basically kill everybody, when you have the defense minister saying they're all human animals, not talking about Hamas, this is policy. I mean, these are the top people. And if you look at the actions of the Israeli soldiers on the ground, whether it's the disproportionate harm to civilians or the siege, this devastating siege that is causing such severe deprivation to so many Palestinians, that is spreading starvation across Gaza, it's hard to say that this isn't policy. So I think that that's what they're saying for public relations purposes. I don't think it's going to work as an argument in court.
Israel, at the same time as what you've just described, has dropped leaflets from the sky urging Palestinians to flee, what the IDF calls safer areas, uses text messages, calls to warn Gazans a strike's about to come. It's created humanitarian zones and corridors in Gaza. Does any of that suggest that Israel's intentions, again, are less black and white than you suggest?
Yeah, I think that those are going to be the more sophisticated defenses that Israel mounts tomorrow. And we've heard, spokespeople say, oh, they should be charging Hamas with genocide. Hamas committed atrocities. But, as Israel of all places should know, conduct by one side doesn't justify genocide by the other. Nothing justifies genocide. Now, with respect to the...
Yeah, I want to just second that, because I think that's one of the arguments you hear from people. In fact, maybe I'll show that comment, because to me, it doesn't work. You don't get to kill people because some other people attacked you. You just don't get to do that. You just don't get to do that. And I understand that's going to be the argument. To me, it's a complete loser. How is that defense? You're not defending anyone. When you kill Gazans, innocent civilians, when you bomb villages and cities, you're not saving anyone's life. You're not protecting anybody. So I find that argument, I don't, it seems so intellectually empty and clearly morally, bankrupt. So we get to kill you because some other people killed us? Is that it? Again, completely fails on every level, in my opinion. So this was from one of my commenters. Hal Ginsberg, the hard truth is FAFO. And I looked at that FAFO, meaning F-A, find out. Is it F-U, find out? F-up, find out? Is real. The hubris of the 10/7 attack truly falls to the level of being criminally stupid on the part of Hamas. Once you have chosen to light the fuse, it's on you. So the argument is somehow because Israel is now leveling Gaza and killing thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of innocent people and children. That's, I don't understand that. I just don't get that. I mean, you could make the argument certainly that, well, the fault of when the Allies turned German cities into rubble during World War II, you would say, well, that's the fault of the German government. And it's not the fault of the Allies. But yes, it was. We shouldn't have turned Dresden into a slaughterhouse. We shouldn't have bombed these beautiful medieval cities into rubble. It didn't have military. There wasn't a military purpose to it. We should have used our bombs to stop the trains from going to the death camps. We should have used our bombs to blow up the railroads that were transporting supplies to the German armies. Not to kill civilians, but even and there's no clarity that doing that killing civilians really shortened the war in any way. But that was a total war. There was a nation state, a true nation, Germany, that had launched a war against the West, against Western democracies, and against Russia. That was a nation state. Gaza is not a nation state. Gaza is a occupied area largely under Israeli control, and it has been for decades. This is not war. It's just killing. So this argument I find so, I lose, sometimes I read what some people say who watch my videos and listen to my program or who respond to what I've written, and I'm just agog. I cannot understand how you could get misunderstand what I think is clear. But obviously, for those folks, to be fair, to them, they see it clearly and I don't. So I don't know where you go with that. It's just very, very unfortunate. Because thousands and thousands and thousands of people are being killed, and potentially millions or over a million will die in Gaza from starvation. Okay, let's get back to this. Is it genocide? And again, despite all the evidence of Israel committing, if you want to call it war, then they're committing war crimes. If you want to say what they're doing in Gaza is a war, then they're committing war crimes.
Yes, that's the right thing to do in principle, but they're giving warnings in an inhumane way. They're sending people to the South, and as South Africa noted today, they continue to drop 2,000-pound bombs in the South. They are depriving the people in that area of the most basic necessities. They're letting in just drips and drabs of humanitarian aid. The warnings, again, look almost as if they're public relations. They're not really humane efforts. The big defense, I think, is going to be this mantra of human shields, which we hear all the time. And yes, Hamas uses human shields. Yes, Hamas fights from civilian areas, but there's a duty on the attacker, even if fighting and targeting a military target, to not fire if there will be disproportionate harm, regardless of human shields.
The text of South Africa's case does not acknowledge that under the law of armed conflict, Israel has the right to self-defense, nor, as you just mentioned, does it really acknowledge how Hamas fights embedded within civilian areas. Are those weaknesses in South Africa's case?
Well, South Africa made a point of saying, they condemn Hamas's atrocities on October 7th, as they should, as everybody does. Israel has the right to defend itself, but the point is it has to defend itself lawfully within the Geneva Conventions, targeting Hamas, not targeting the civilian population, certainly not committing genocide. And this, deprivation of the civilian population, 85% displaced, very little food, very little water, the hospitals shut down. This seems to be designed to impose conditions of hardship that, as South Africa says, could lead to massive loss of life, to even more loss of life than the bombing directly.
And
all right, so I'll stop it there for the moment. He basically made the same arguments that I made before we played the video Kenneth Roth did, but obviously he has a lot more gravitas than I do, president of Human Rights Watch. And to be fair, I won't say I stole the arguments from him, but certainly I think the arguments are kind of obvious, right? I mean, you can go right through it and see what Israel's doing and see how it does or doesn't meet the definition of genocide. I think, Roth did that a pretty, clear-cut job. So let's listen to the other side. Let's watch the other video portion of this PBS NewsHour segment and see whether we find the response that it's not genocide compelling. And again, I see the argument. The fact of the matter is you don't have, and this is what someone said to me, you don't have, genocide should be really reserved, I believe, for the worst of the worst possible cases. Does this rise to that level? I'm not saying it doesn't, but is it so obvious that it does? All right, I'll give you one more of, so let's see if we can, here we go.
That South Africa has shown Israel's intent to destroy in whole or in part Palestinians.
No, I think South Africa did work quite effectively on introducing some circumstantial evidence for its claim. It did point to a lot of harm, a lot of suffering, a lot of damage inflicted on Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And it also it allocated significant time also to flesh out a lot of statements that were given by Israeli officials. There are still many, many holes in the narrative that they are presenting before the court.
So let's talk about some of those statements. Ken Roth and the South Africans cited the same one. When Prime Minister Netanyahu cites a biblical story in which the enemies of Jews are destroyed and vows Israel should achieve the same aim in Gaza, does that not show intent to destroy at least part of Palestinians in Gaza?
I think these are very ambiguous statements. I mean, I wouldn't defend these statements. I wish they wouldn't have been uttered. I think they were playing to a political base. But in the Israeli context, calling an enemy like Iran or like the Nazis or like Hamas, Amalek, is something that is done all the time. And this is in the Israeli context, this is what you refer to your mortal enemies. And you use a biblical reference in order to beef it up and make it sound a little bit more flashy to your home base. Actually, in the first statement that Netanyahu issued, which is cited in the South African application, he also emphasized that the IDF, unlike Hamas, is observing the laws of war and that it is not harming civilians. So I think it's quite a stretch to build the entire case and to basically allege that there is a genocidal plan, an actual plan of action on the basis of an imprudent statement that was made by a politician. In the end, the Israeli military is an organized military, and it operates on the basis of cabinet decisions and specific directives. It doesn't listen to what a politician say and then goes and changes its plans of action. This is not how things work.
Yeah, but I mean, so his argument is that when Netanyahu justifies the Israeli campaign against Gaza by invoking biblical references to the elimination by, I guess, the Hebrews of a neighboring group that called Amalek, that somehow that doesn't reflect genocidal intent by Israel. But of course, Netanyahu is the president of the country. He is, runs civilian control over the military. So the military is responding to his lead. And it's not just words. That's one of the things that is very frustrating when those who criticize Hamas and say, well, it's not fair to say Israel's genocidal. Look at Hamas's charter. Hamas is dedicated to the elimination of Israel. They say from the river to the sea, although obviously that's ambiguous at worst. Those are words. Those are words by a group that has little or no power. They can kill, they can lash out now and again, but they have no real control. They represent a persecuted and oppressed people. But Israel does have the power to kill in massive numbers, and it is exercising that power. So when the president invokes a biblical story in which a traditional enemy of the Jewish people was eliminated, was wiped out completely, that does reflect an intent, a very ugly intent, where there is the possibility that it could in fact become reality.
Every specific attack has to be cleared by lawyers who work for the IDF. This is simply the insinuation that a statement by a minister would then lead the chief of staff to change the operational plan simply has limited bearing.
All right, and so he says, well, and also, look, we can't, it's not just the president says go ahead and bomb a hospital. We have to clear everything with lawyers. I mean, what kind of a defense is that? Think about the tortured Abu Ghraib. W. Cheney got a lawyer named John Yoo to green light the torture and say, oh, if the president wants to do it, it's a unitary presidency, the executive branch, then they can do it. He has authority to do it. And that guy, John Yoo, a lawyer, is now a professor at Berkeley, at Cal Berkeley Law School. So this idea that somehow if lawyers say it's okay, then it must be okay. The Nazis had a doctor who examined people at Auschwitz. Does that make it mean that it was okay that they were being treated humanely? It seems like a crazy argument. And in fact, that's because it is a crazy argument.
Reality.
Staying on statements for a minute, the convention also requires Israel to prevent and not incite genocide. Has Israel punished some of perhaps the lower level officials when they suggest the goals of the operation are to destroy not just Hamas, but all of Gaza?
Well, here I think the South Africans do have a point. I think so far Israel has not been diligent in taking steps against public figures who have made some outrageous statements that seem to violate international law. I would note that the Attorney General this week has issued a statement that she will actually consider prosecuting individuals who have incited to harm uninvolved civilians. But one could say that this is a little bit late in the game. So by and large, I would say that Israel has not handled this aspect of the war quite well. And there has been too many wild statements out there which have not been adequately responded to. But there is a huge distance between not dealing sufficiently tough, not cracking down on hate speech and on incitement, and actually attributing those statements to the actual conduct of the IDF on the field, which, like you said before, the IDF operation is a war, which is a very difficult and very tough urban warfare with an enemy that is completely embedded within and below the civilian population, and actually trying to, this is something, by the way, the South African team completely left out from its narrative. So according to the presentations we have heard today, there was a tragedy, a massacre in October 7, and then nothing. Then Hamas disappears from the story. It's only the Israelis who are dropping bombs. The story is much more complex, and the statements are background noise, which is indeed annoying, and it is indeed at some level even dangerous, but it is not really the driving force of the story.
All right, so it is the driving force because this is what Israel has been doing for 20 plus years. And if Israel were really concerned about the hostages and were really concerned about its own security, then it would have, again, called in the United Nations. It would have called in U.S. peacekeeping forces. It would have negotiated with Hamas. It would have discussed how to address the crime that was committed on October 7th, to hold responsible the perpetrators, and to prevent future crimes like October 7th from happening again. The way you do that is you stop oppressing and persecuting the people of Palestine. But that's the opposite of what Israel's doing, and that's why Israel is under attack, or was under attack on that date. To say that this somehow is a response to Hamas just doesn't comport with the history. Hamas is the excuse, the catalyst for this orgy of violence by Israel that is leading to untold death and destruction. And I say untold because you have 1 million people who are at risk right now of starving to death. Again, if you look at the argument against genocide, if you look at those who, I thought Yuval Shavnai did a fair job. He did acknowledge that the statements that Israel is making are wrong. But he didn't talk about the tragic loss of civilian life in Gaza, or the extraordinary overreaction by Israel that is not in any way fairly, legitimately, rightly designed to prevent future violence. Bret Stephens, I have quoted him with some favor recently, New York Times columnist. I thought, wrote pretty cogently, pretty persuasively about what happened at Harvard with the president there, and why we're all, why there's she became a lightning rod. It wasn't about whether she was qualified, whether the former president Claudine Gay was qualified to be president, whether she deserved to stay on or not, but became a battle between two groups who were each determined to see their side win. And the reality of the situation of a barely qualified administrator who was not a champion in any way of free speech, that was lost in the shovel. Here, Stevens' column is so wrong-headed, so misguided. It's really is in and of itself is a moral obscenity. The moral obscenity is that Bret Stephens calls the charge against Israel a moral obscenity. Israel is slaughtering Gazans, and it continues to do so. For Stephens to claim that it's wrong, it's not just even wrong, it's an obscenity to claim that they're committing genocide. It's a big lie, right? It's like you tell a huge lie so people will think, well, maybe he's a little strong, but it is terrible. How can we possibly call Israel genocidal? And we just went through it. I thought Ken Roth from Human Rights Watch did an outstanding job. And I mentioned, by the way, that you can really learn a lot about what's right, what's wrong, by examining the arguments of people maybe you disagree with. Do they make good cases? If their case is weak, then does that mean, that strengthens, right? You can ironically strengthen the case of your opponent in an argument if you make very weak arguments, transparently false arguments. And that's exactly what Bret Stephens does here. So in trying to claim that Israel's not committing genocide, he points to other atrocities and claims those are better examples, I suppose. So he mentions the famine in North Korea that was induced by the government of North Korea. I guess the Kim Jong dynasty. He talks about hundreds of thousands of Syrians gassed, bombed, starved, or tortured by the Assad regime, he claims, with massive displacement, and also what the Chinese government is doing to the Uyghurs. So let's go through that. The North Korean government isn't trying to wipe out North Koreans. The North Korean government is tyrannical, it's dictatorial, it's bizarre. It's murderous. They're not trying to wipe out North Koreans. They're not targeting an entire people. That is their people. They're not trying to kill every North Korean. That's not genocide. It's the exact same thing. Assad in Syria, to the extent he's killing his own people, is not trying to eliminate every Syrian. Also, Stephens very much overplays his hand, talking about gassing, bombing, starving. Many of the claims by the West, by both the Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations of terrible crimes by Syria have been, if not debunked, called into very serious question, especially the gas attacks, which most likely came from our allies' false flag attacks in Syria, some of those. So that's not, the evidence doesn't strongly support his allegations of murder by the Syrian government, at least certainly not in the numbers that he provides, that is Stephens. But again, it's the government of the people that's killing its own people. That is not genocide. They are not trying to wipe out. The Assad regime is not trying to kill every Syrian. It's not the same. In Israel, the target is a different group of people. The Israeli government, the government of the Jewish state, is targeting Muslims, Gazans, Palestinians. That is qualitatively different than what North Korea government has done, the Syrian government has done. And that's why Israel can fairly be alleged, not saying it's correctly, but can be charged with genocide, whereas neither the Kim Jong-un or Kim Jong-il regimes or the Syrian regimes can be. And then I think the Uyghur case is a little stronger. And if you want to claim China is killing the Uyghurs, that is genocide, okay. I understand that there's questions about how true that is. Certainly Max Blumenthal has called it into question. We don't have the images the way we do have images of Gaza. It's not the same in that regard. And also, it's not every Uyghur, right? All of Gaza, all of Palestine is under occupation by Israel. But the Uyghurs are not all being, as I understand, persecuted by China. I think there's about 10 or 11 million Uyghurs. That said, I'm not excusing what China is doing. It is really bad. And maybe it should also be considered on the list of genocide. But it doesn't excuse, it doesn't exonerate what Israel's doing, whatever China's doing. The other two examples are absurd, and Stephens should know better. And in fact, he does. He's just trying to muddy the waters. So then he goes into this kind of defense mode. Rather than pointing fingers at others, he says here, if Israel were trying to commit genocide, it wouldn't be putting its soldiers at risk or allowing humanitarian relief to arrive from Egypt, or and then it would be withdrawing troops that would still be killing Palestinians everywhere in vastly greater numbers. All right, so let's get into that. It's been consistently keeping humanitarian relief to arrive from Egypt. There's been extraordinary pressure brought to bear on Israel to let in the relief, and it's doing it as slowly and as grudgingly as possible, to the extent where, again, over 1 million Gazans are at risk of starvation right now. We'll talk about the withdrawing forces. I got a little clip I want to play there. And I don't know, I mean, how many more Palestinians does Israel have to kill for Bret Stephens to be, outraged? The humanitarian relief also, as I understand it, the Nazis did allow Red Cross into at least one concentration camp. It was sort of their show camp. So there was a tiny bit of relief allowed in. I don't find this compelling. I don't find those arguments to be particularly powerful. I wonder, though, again, if we want to look at what Israel's doing and say this is at the same level of evil as what the Nazis are doing or did do, and I'm not clear. So Stephens continues with his distraction campaign, saying, well, it's not Israel, it's Hamas. Hamas is to blame. And again, what one wrong doesn't make another. Two wrongs don't make a right. It's not okay for Israel to kill tens of thousands of Gazans because Hamas committed a crime on October 7th. It just doesn't excuse the other. Hamas doesn't have the ability, the power to kill mass numbers of Israelis. It committed an attack, and it was a terrible attack. It was a terrible crime. They should be brought to justice for it. It was a one-off, much like 9/11 here. You aren't a genocidal organization unless you have the power to commit genocide. Calling for the obliteration of Israel does not necessarily mean the genocide of all the Jews in Israel. It means that it shouldn't be a Jewish state. There shouldn't be a Jewish state. I'm not going to get into the the translations. Stephens picks a particular translation that he feels supports his view. But again, and I've said this over and over, Israel has the power. If they want to feel secure in their borders, they need to treat everyone who lives there justly, fairly, equally. Israel has the power. Hamas, the Palestinians, do not. All right, finally, I just want to end with this. Well, it won't quite end. I want to play this quick clip in response to what Stephens said that Israel's withdrawing. So this is from, I believe, yesterday, France 24.
And for more, we cross to Jerusalem and correspondent Iris Makler. Iris, talk of a new phase, but a lot of fighting this Tuesday.
That's right, because I guess the truth is that while war is extremely dangerous, the problem comes when war appears to be over and then isn't over. Then it's both confusing, dangerous, and treacherous. And I think that's what we're seeing on the ground right now. Israel had began withdrawing troops from the north of the Gaza Strip at the turn of the new year. Thousands of troops were withdrawn. Fighting was concentrated in the center and in the south. Nevertheless, today we saw an upsurge in violence, both fighting in the north of the Gaza Strip. We saw civilians, Palestinian civilians, who said, we were planning to return to our homes there, and thank God we didn't, because it was an onslaught such as we haven't heard from right back at the beginning of the first phase, back at the end of October. So, there's been that resumption of fighting. And at the same time, we saw a slew of rockets, a barrage of rockets coming.
All right, so I'm going to stop that for a sec. So Israel's saying it's withdrawing, right? That's what Brett Stevens says. Oh, well, if it was genocide, Israel wouldn't be withdrawing troops. It withdrew troops from an area where there was nobody. It was empty. It was a vacuum. It was an area that was, no longer occupied. I mean, who are they going to kill? There's no one to kill there because there was no one there. And once they started pulling back, that's when Gazans started to return. And once they returned, the killing began again. And you can see Israel continues to pound Gaza, tanks storm back into north areas where they had withdrawn, from which they had withdrawn. Now, it's a little bit more complex because along with the Palestinian people, the Gazans, the civilians, were Hamas as well. And that's why Israel will claim, that's what Israel says, well, we had to come back, we had to return because Hamas was returning. And I'll address that in a moment, but let me just play a little
into
more.
Israel from the north of the Gaza Strip. So the place appears to be empty. Israeli troops appear to have withdrawn, and nevertheless, there's fighting there. And the Hamas-run health ministry has reported 158 deaths today. I'm sure they include combatants, but nevertheless, that's a significant number. And that's when troops have withdrawn. So you see two things happening at once, Francois. One is that when there's a vacuum, it's filled. So Palestinians are trickling back to their homes, prepared to live if they exist, or even to rebuild. The other is that the authorities are trickling back, and that includes Hamas. We've heard reports from two sources now that Hamas is returning to run hospitals in the north of the Gaza Strip.
All right, so you can see the rubble. You can see, I don't know whether that's IDF, who those pictures are of, but what Israel is responding to, allegedly, is the return of Hamas to run the hospitals. Hamas is the government of Palestine. To the extent there's any kind of civilian authority, as well as a military, it is Hamas. So, of course, if people are going to return to this rubble, this bomb inflicted, the area that's been leveled largely is, empty, doesn't have infrastructure. Well, of course, the government, which is Hamas, is going to have to be there too, to provide water, to provide services, to turn on the electricity. So for Israel to say, well, Hamas came back, so we had to go kill them again, is crazy. They're going to come back as soon as you leave, of course, because they have to provide the services that the people who lived there and are trying to return will need.
If that's right, then what was this whole fight about from Israel's point of view?
Yeah, and
meanwhile, how are they going to? Again, that's a good question. What was it all about? But if Israel really wants no more killing, if they really aren't trying to just wipe out Gaza and Palestinians there, then why not keep humanitarian forces there? Why not start turning the water back on, the electricity back on? Why not have your, part of the IDF there to help the people? That's not their goal. The goal is to kill. The goal is to is to take control of that area, clearly, or for it to be just barren, void, empty. Certainly not to let the current Palestinian Authority, which is Hamas, back. And if that's your goal, okay, well then, if you really aren't trying to just wipe the population out, why aren't you providing an alternative? Why aren't you providing a military government that will at least, an Israeli government there that will help the people out and transition peacefully? But that's not what they're trying to do. That's clearly not what they're doing. So that argument by Stevens clearly fails. Their withdrawal is contingent on Gaza remaining Hamas free, and apparently, at least northern Gaza, civilian free. Sort of sounds like genocide, doesn't it? All right, I want to end with this. So the final point I'll make, and we have not come to an answer. I think it seems clear that there's a very plausible case. Maybe it's not open and shut. A very strong case that yes, Israel's committing genocide against Gaza, against Gazan Palestinians, and maybe against Palestinians generally. But certainly a strong case. I think what causes many of us to question that is we aren't seeing this. We aren't seeing victims herded into railway cars and transported to death camps. And, that's an argument. I mean, it really is, right? I mean, that seems to me to raise the question of what is indeed a genocide. All right, I'll be back tomorrow. We actually have my friend Liz Croydon back, the comedian. So we'll talk to her and also her friend Haywood Turnipseed Jr., who is also a comedian. Looking forward to maybe a little less grim, a little less dark topic tomorrow. Thanks again for tuning in to Halitics. I do hope you'll subscribe. We'll maybe work on that subscribe button. I'm going to go look at that and see how it came across. And I'll be back tomorrow.